In Newcastle, Tracy Davies and Mark Coghill met through a Lonely Hearts column and began a fairly serious relationship. All seemed to be going well until the night of Mark's 45th birthday in October 2008. They had bought 2 bottles of vodka before going out to celebrate in their local pub. Tracy, a recovering alcoholic, was upset because she had just gotten some bad news. She was not pregnant. It's understandable that this news could be quite upsetting for her because she was getting on in years and had no children. So she asked Mark for a kiss to lift her spirits. When he obliged, she proceeded to bite his tongue. Mark says that he thought it was a joke at first until she refused to let go after several seconds of severe pain. He says that Tracy even made noises of satisfaction, which he described in possibly the most British way ever as, like if you have a cup of tea when you haven't had one for a few days. Tracy continued to bite down until the top third of Mark's tongue came off, at which point she spat it on the floor. Tracy called the ambulance herself and confessed to her crime. But she was surprised when she was arrested. The tongue could not be reattached for fear of infection, meaning that Mark now has trouble tasting and speaking. Tracy was sentenced to 3 years in prison. While not exactly a couple, Wayne Robinson, 24, and Dominique Fisher, 22, met one drunken Friday night in June 2008 and decided to spend the entire weekend together in Blackburn, England. While most people would advise a woman against running off with a man she barely knows and just met at a nightclub, that wasn't a concern for Dominique. Probably because she knew it was Wayne who should be afraid of her. On the third and final day of their star-crossed relationship, Wayne woke up to find Dominique snoring beside him in bed, which was covered in his own blood. Wayne quickly realized that he had huge gashes all over his arms and back, forming intricate designs, and even Dominique's name. Having mixed volume with alcohol the night before, Wayne had passed out before Dominique used a Stanley knife to tattoo him as he slept. As soon as he saw what she had done, he fled the scene and contacted police. Dominique claimed that Wayne had requested the unusual body art. She was found guilty by a jury that took less than an hour and a half to reach the verdict. However, she did not receive jail time, just a 2-year community order. Blair Adams was an average 31-year-old Canadian construction worker who, on July 5th, 1996, suddenly withdrew all the money in his bank account, emptied his safe deposit box, grabbed everything of any value from his home that he could fit in his pockets, and made a beeline for the United States border. Unfortunately for Adams, it turns out the U.S. Border Patrol tends to be suspicious of young men trying to enter America along with giant suitcases full of money, even from the Canadian side, so he was turned away. The next day, Adams quit his job and bought a plane ticket to Germany, immediately changed his mind and got a refund on the ticket, then showed up at a friend's house insisting that someone wanted to kill him. He begged his friend to smuggle him into America. When she refused, Adams got a rental card and tried again across the border. This time he got through, and once he was in Seattle, he bought a plane ticket to Washington, D.C., then drove to Knoxville, Tennessee. This is less a sightseeing route and more like the path of a man who is desperately trying to lose something that he thinks is chasing him. Once in Tennessee, witnesses reported that Adams entered a gas station and complained that his car wouldn't start. The attendant investigated and found that Adams had the wrong keys, even though he obviously managed to drive that car to the gas station somehow. He then hitchhiked to a hotel, paid for a room, but never went into it. After handing over the money, he immediately left the hotel and never came back. Hours later, his dead body was found in a parking lot half a mile from the hotel. His pants had been removed, forcibly it looked like, and the cause of death was found to be a single apocalyptic punch to the stomach, so powerful that it ruptured his internal organs. That's all anyone knows. To this day, nobody can explain who Blair Adams thought was after him or who challenged this Canadian man to a final, pantsless, stomach-punching contest in Knoxville, Tennessee. My parents had just moved into a new house in the country. My oldest sister and brother were alive, and my mom was pregnant with my other sister at the time. They were busy unpacking boxes in the basement when there was a knock on the front door. My mom answered the door and there were 3 men standing outside. They said their car had broken down on the interstate and they just needed to use the phone to call a tow truck. The interstate was nearly 2 miles away, and several houses stood between there and my parents' house. My mother said she got a bad vibe from them, so she slammed the door in their face and locked it. The door slamming startled my dad, who ran upstairs to see if everything was all right. As my mom is telling him about 3 men, they hear a thud on the door and realize these men are trying to break through the door with an axe. The door was made of metal. My dad puts his back against the door to try to keep them from getting in and tells my mom to find the phone in the boxes, plug it in and call the cops, then to find his gun in the moving boxes and bring it to him. She runs downstairs, finds the phone, gets it plugged in, and calls the police while my dad stands with his back to the door shouting that he has a gun. The men stop, drop the axe, and run into the woods. My parents found their gun in the boxes, made sure all the doors are locked, and wait for the police to arrive. When the police show up, they do a manhunt in the woods and eventually find the men. Turns out they had escaped from prison. 2 were in for murder and the 3rd man was armed robbery. And the car they stole had in fact broken down on the interstate. They said they stopped at my parents' house because there were no neighbors close by and they figured they could hide out there for a while without being bothered. For me, the scariest part was the fact that instead of getting rid of the metal door with axe holes in it, they moved it into the basement doorway and moved the basement door to the front door. So my whole childhood, anytime I saw the basement door, I was reminded about some axe-wielding convicts who wanted to chop our door down and break in. I was almost killed by a wannabe gangster. That's a nice story that always gets my family on edge when I tell them. Basically, I was walking home from my dead-end pizza job back to my house. I've talked about this a few times on Reddit, but basically, I live in one of the 2 housing authorities in my town, and each one has a rival gang in it. They're basically wannabe Bloods and Crips. A few months before this happened, I was almost robbed by one of the girls who lived at the other authority. What I didn't know was that she was basically the main, and I'ma use quotations, hoe of the main gangbanger there. She tried to trick me into opening a bottle of wine for her. I grabbed the wine to take it into the kitchen to get the opener. She pulls a gun, and I stare her down for a second or two before knocking her on the head with the bottle. Police are called, and I had fun with the legal system, but a camera saved me from anything serious. Anyway, I was walking home and I guess one of the guys decided I needed to be dealt with because I noticed someone following behind me. He had his hood drawn up and he was walking a decent ways behind me and he kept his hands in his pocket. I was keeping an eye on him and I pulled out my phone and pretended to call my work to ask if anyone was still there because I had forgotten something. so I took a few side streets to see if he was following me or not. He was, and I made it back to the store and walked inside. We called the police and they showed up and took a statement and left, and I assumed that he had left too because of the police. My friend insists that he drives me home, but I declined as I had a knife on me. Stupid, I know, but I really hated having people go out of their way for me since it was like a 10-minute drive out the way due to traffic, and that I'd be alright. About 5 minutes later, I'm getting somewhat close to home, and I pulled out my phone and saw his reflection behind me. So being the idiot I am, I whip around and put on my best Kratos impression, very loudly but sternly yell, "What the hell do you want?" Mind you, because of my physique, I'm rather intimidating to most people. I guess I spooked him because he just turned around and darted in the other direction. Luckily, the police caught him a few days later for breaking into someone's house. I heard through the grapevine that he always carried an illegal gun around and that he was going to kill me to become a full member of their little wannabe club. Had a crazy drunk uncle try to kill me for no reason. Back when Smash 64 came out, my friend and I were glued to it. One night, I had him over for a sleepover. We were like 13 or 14. I guess my mom got my uncle to come babysit. My uncle was always a real asshole since I was a kid. I remember him just coming in my room and yelling at me for no reason when I was like 5. He was ex-military, black belt, and a severe alcoholic. So this asshole comes over. I didn't even hear him there. Drinks a whole fifth of whiskey, falls out of a chair, and apparently it's my fault. I just heard him yelling my name. So I go and he flips a table and flips out because I didn't help him back into his chair when I didn't even know he was in the apartment. So I said, "It's not my fault. You're drunk and fell. I didn't even know you were here." And he flips out and slams me through a window. So here I am, glass all sticking out of my back, looking down 3 stories, and all that's stopping me from falling is a guy who drank a fifth of whiskey. Luckily, the neighbors heard before I even came out of my room and called the cops. So cops show up. He pulled me in at the exact moment and they immediately arrested him. I got real lucky on that one. I went over after that and thanked my neighbors and explained if they didn't call the cops, he probably would have murdered me. I've always hated living in such a close proximity to other people, but this time it saved my life. I woke up one Monday morning around 5 a.m. hearing things falling. I lived in an apartment building in the 2nd floor and I thought that someone had fallen down the stairs. I heard "help please" and reluctantly stood up to see what was up. There is no one in the stairs, but in one apartment the lights were on and the door was open. I went inside and saw my neighbor on the floor and a guy on top of him with a knife trying to stab him, and my neighbor holding this guy's wrist to stop him. "Help me, he came through the window." I just stood there waiting to see what was really happening because I literally couldn't believe my eyes until it hit me that this was real, this was happening. My first thought was to call the police, but then I realized that they would never get here on time. I had to take the knife. So I went there and I reached down to the floor like one does to pick up a coin, trying to grab the knife, and then he hit me. I fell to the floor and we continued to struggle there. I have no idea how long that lasted. Could have been 10 seconds or 10 hours. It felt that all my life had been trying to get that knife, that I had spent years doing that and nothing else remotely mattered. I don't remember much of the fight. I remember having his shoes on my face. I remember seeing his shoulder. I remember seeing his face. I remember him trying to stab us, but I have no idea in what order anything happened. I just know at some point, somehow, I did get the knife. I stood up and the guy turned towards me to take the knife again, but he had his back to my neighbor and he was able to knock him down and pin him to the floor. Then I called the police, and the rest, bureaucracy. Edwin Smith was tired and grateful to be heading home at just after midnight on April 23rd, 1960. As he passed between Claiborne and St. Paul Avenues, he thought he heard someone screaming. He stopped his car and listened. Sure enough, he heard cries for help coming from an alleyway. Running to it, he couldn't believe what he saw. An elderly woman, later identified as 76-year-old Ida Lowery, was lying in the alley covered in blood and bruises. When he tried to help her, she screamed in pain, so he left to call the police instead. Unfortunately, an hour later, after police arrived and transported Ida to the hospital, she died. Before she drew her last breath, however, Ida was able to tell the police that a big white man who worked at the bridge grabbed her and hit her with a heavy object. He then raped her. When he was done, he simply left her to die in the alley. An investigation into Ida's life revealed that she was somewhat of an eccentric loner who loved rifling through garbage cans. She had two sisters, both of whom hadn't seen her for a while. Police ramped up their search for suspects and identified 6 men of interest within just a few days. None of them were ever charged. A 24-year-old man falsely confessed to the murder, and over the next few weeks, many others were questioned. However, Ida Lowery's murderer is yet to be found. On August 23, 1987, a cargo train was traveling through Alexander, Arkansas, when the driver saw something on the tracks ahead. As the train closed in on the object, he could see it was a body. He then realized that there were in fact 2 bodies lying across the tracks, in the way of his oncoming train. Attempting desperately to stop and blowing the horn incessantly, the driver almost succeeded in avoiding hitting the bodies, but unfortunately, the train's momentum caused it to roll over them. An investigation revealed that the bodies were those of 16-year-old Don Henry and 17-year-old Kevin Ives. Initially, it was suspected that the boys had fallen asleep on the tracks due to heavy use of marijuana. However, both sets of parents insisted that a second autopsy be conducted. Eventually, a pathologist realized that the marks on Don Henry's shirt were consistent with a stabbing injury, and that Kevin Ives' skull had been crushed, possibly by the rifle he used to hunt with. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a man dressed in military attire a week before the train incident, as well as the same day the train hit the boys. One theory had it that the boys may have stumbled across a drug dealing operation and had been murdered for it. Police investigated all possible leads, but they all led to a dead end. To date, the boys' killer remains unknown. Close to 20 years ago now, a guy on Australia's Gold Coast got away with a bank robbery in broad daylight. He cased the bank for a while and discovered a pattern of the bank manager arriving about 30 minutes before anyone else each morning, where he would leave the front doors unlocked so staff could help themselves in without a key or needing to wait for the boss to come and let them in. One morning, the crook dressed himself up for a busy day of office work and waited for the bank manager to arrive. As the manager was unlocking the doors, he made his move, entering the building and threatening the manager with a gun. He got all the details he needed to access the vault and so forth, and then he tied the manager up and stuffed him in his office. When the staff arrived, he told him that the manager had called in sick and that the regional office had sent him to open the bank. No one batted an eyelid. The bank had a small walk-in vault that normally only had $30,000 to $50,000 on any given day. But the bank robber had timed his robbery for the morning after business banking day, when all the local businesses would make their end of the week deposits and reportedly got a score of $250,000. Once the vault was open, he pulled his gun out and invited all the staff to enter the vault and lock them in. By this stage, the bank was due to be open, so when he went to leave, there were a number of customers waiting to get inside to do their banking. He told them all that there had been an issue with the computers and that the tech team had estimated it would take about 30 minutes before the issue would be resolved and that they couldn't open until then. Then, he got into his car and drove straight to the airport and flew to Hong Kong and then disappeared. The cops never caught him. They knew he'd have had to leave most of it in Australia somewhere, because you can only take 10,000 cash in any currency out of the country before customs pulls you into their interview rooms. So the assumption was that he had to have an accomplice in Australia who would funnel the money to him slowly over time. Peter Curtin was a brutal serial killer who was caught by complete accident. Curtin committed his first murder at only 9 years old, a double homicide, by drowning 2 other boys on a rafting trip. Between 1913 and 1929, Curtin murdered at least 9 people and tried to kill at least 31 others. He would eventually receive the death penalty for his crimes and was executed by guillotine. After a long killing spree, this psychopathic murderer ended up entangled in a story-like twist of fate that seemed straight out of fiction. In 1930, after Curtin had terrorized Germany, causing hysteria and panic throughout the country, a young woman named Maria Butlick moved to Curtin's hometown of Dusseldorf and responded to an advertisement for a place to stay. Knowing that the monster was out there, she kept a watchful eye, but met the man who was supposed to provide her with a new place to live. When the man asked her to cut through an alley with him, she became startled and refused, thinking she was face to face with a serial murderer. The man was highly offended, and a dispute broke out. Then another man, Peter Curtin, the actual killer himself, stepped in and escorted the woman away from the fight. She was walking right into the arms of a murderer. He took her into his home, where he would attempt to have sex with her, but when she refused, he took her back to the train station and raped her in the nearby woods. He later said that he did not kill her because she did not resist the rape. Maria Butlick, after being raped, decided not to go to the authorities, but rather penned a letter detailing what had happened to a friend of hers and sent it through the mail. In a total freak accident, the letter was delivered to the wrong address, and the person who received the letter turned it into the authorities, who promptly contacted Budlick. She then gave police the full story, and they came to Peter Curtin's door looking for answers. He and his wife snuck out of his home and got away. However, as the Great Depression was just beginning to set in and take hold, they came to the realization that his wife would never survive, supposing something happened to him. In a bizarre twist, this horrible serial killer and rapist decided to do one selfless thing in his entire life. He confessed his crimes to his wife and asked that she turn him in for the handsome bounty on his head. She obliged.